Hello, class. Now we are moving on to space, and this will probably be a little bit of a longer of a lecture. You might need to break it up into a couple of different sections if you want to. Now, space refers to the visual flatness or the illusion of depth that's depicted in visual representation. That's in two-dimensional space. Three-dimensional space refers to the actual physical environment and how it functions in a particular context. So, there's three different types of perspective in two-dimensional artwork. And of course, perspective refers to how space is represented in two-dimensional artwork. So, perspective is the method which is utilized to either communicate depth or give the illusion of realistic space in space, or realistic depth in space. Three basic types of perspective in the West are a divergent or a reverse perspective, which was utilized mostly in the medieval ages. We have intuitive perspective, which was utilized in the late medieval period. And then we have linear perspective, which was developed during the Italian Renaissance around 1425. Now, in non-Western cultures, like in the East, Asian cultures used vertical perspective to depict space, and I'll cover that briefly as we continue on in this particular section. Now, the first two-dimensional perspective that we're going to talk about is divergent perspective. Wait a minute, that's not exactly right. That's not the right type of divergent perspective. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know how that slide got in there. Okay, divergent perspective. This was common in the Middle Ages, and divergent perspective is the opposite of how actual perspective works. Basically, it went under the assumption that light travels from the eye and bounces off the things in the world. And that's exactly the opposite of how light works. What happens is that light bounces off of things and enters into your eyeballs. So the direction of divergent perspective goes out like that. So objects that go away from you tend to get wider as they go away from you. And again, this is exactly the opposite way of how real objects appear to you in real life. Now, certain artists actually did play around with divergent perspective, but they're doing it on purpose. One example here is Picasso, The Reservoir, and in this work you can see how he uses divergent perspective in order to play with the shapes, which are the most important thing in this cubist piece that he's created around 1909. Now, the next sense of perspective that we're going to talk about is intuitive perspective. Intuitive perspective was looking at the world around you and guessing at what the way that things are and coming close to how they were actually supposed to be. So here, if we take February from the Book of Hours that the Limburg brothers created in the late 1300s, early 1400s, they recognize that the farther something goes away from you, the smaller that it is. So the city is smaller than these people who are in the middle ground, who are smaller than these people who are in the foreground. But the scale is not correct, because either this city is only about 6 feet tall, or this donkey and this man right here are actually about 35 feet tall, based off of the scale between the figures here and the actual town that you see in the distance. So that's intuitive perspective, is that they're using their intuition to depict space but they don't exactly have it mathematically precise, and so even though it's better than divergent perspective, it still isn't as strong as linear perspective, which will be developed in the early Renaissance. Another example of intuitive perspective. So in divergent perspective, the chair would be going like this, and then it would be going out like that, which it's not doing. It's actually smaller at the end than it is at the beginning, and you can see that it is converging towards an intuitive vanishing point, but the table is going to another kind of vanishing point, and they're not going to the same vanishing point. And that is because they know that it gets smaller as it gets farther away, but they haven't realized yet that everything should be going to one particular vanishing point. And that will be developed in the near future. And that development is what's known as linear perspective. Now, linear perspective is a mathematical depiction of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane. So here's an example of linear perspective. Now, linear perspective basically consists of three different parts. You have a horizon line, and then you have a vanishing point, and then you have orthogonals, or these conversion lines. Those are the three basic elements of linear perspective. Now, the horizon line is always going to be at eye level. So everybody's horizon line is going to be slightly different because the horizon line is always going to be at whatever your eye level is. And the vanishing point in one point perspective is always in line with who you are. So you can imagine yourself standing right here. And this is where your eyes would be. So your vanishing point is always going to be kind of in between your two eyes, which is at the horizon line, which the horizon line is always going to be at eye level. Okay, so in one point perspective, everything that is perpendicular to you, everything that's parallel to you is always going to remain straight and parallel to you. So these lines are always going to go straight from one side of the page to the other. They're not going to go like that or like that. Anything that is parallel to you will always be parallel to you. Also, anything that is straight up and down or vertical is always going to be straight up and down, vertical. The only thing that moves in weird ways is anything that is perpendicular to you. So perpendicular is, say this is your body right here, and this is your head, and this is the way that you're looking. It'd be the way that you're looking, that's what's perpendicular to you. So if you were standing right here, this is where your feet are, this is what's perpendicular to you, and that's always going to go to the vanishing point. And anything else that is perpendicular to you is also going to be going to the vanishing point. And those lines will change based off of what their relationship is to the vanishing point. So those lines have a special name, and they're called orthogonals. Orthogonals, orthogonals. And those are the only lines that are angled in one point perspective. So lines that are parallel to you remain parallel to you. Lines that are vertical to you always remain vertical to you. It's only the lines that are perpendicular to you that are going to change, and those are called orthogonals. Another example, this shows you everybody in perspective. These people are all the same height, amazingly, but you can see how small this is compared to this person right here. Even though when it's farther away and up, when it's in good perspective, everything seems nice and natural. Now, here's an example of two-point perspective, which I'm just showing you for reference. I really don't want you to kind of learn a whole lot about it, but in two-point perspective refers to when something has a corner to you. So imagine like this was a box, and one corner of it was directed towards you. That is going to result in two-point perspective. Now notice that the arches are in one-point perspective, but because this box is angled to you, it's going to be in two-point perspective. But notice the vanishing points of two-point perspective are always on the horizon line as well. They're just not going to be in the center of the image or where the person's eye is, but they are going to end on the horizon line, which is at the person's height. Here's a Mantegna with the body of the dead Christ done in one-point perspective. This is early on, and they were experimenting with how do you do this with more than just cityscapes and things like that. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper uses one-point perspective. Where do you think the lines are converging at? Well, let's find out. Whee! Oh my goodness, the lines are going to Jesus' head. As you can see, Leonardo is using the orthogonals to draw attention to the focal point of the piece, which is, of course, Jesus' head. And that is where I'm going to end this particular